to go over our Think About It questions on page 153. But first, let's go over kind of what we've been learning throughout this chapter of chapter 6. So we know we've been talking about the Civil War, and the Civil War is basically when the northern states and the southern states were fighting against each other, basically over slavery and freeing slaves and all that. And then afterwards, we've read in chapter 6, lesson 3, we talk about Reconstruction, and we see how things start to change, especially in Mississippi. And so we know that the slaves are getting freed, they're becoming freedmen. Mississippi actually makes a new constitution, sharecropping is going on, and so a lot of new things are happening and good things are happening for slaves during this time. So now let's just kind of review our Think About It questions. Okay, so for number 1, it says, what did the 14th Amendment do? So if I go back and I look at page 151, it tells me in the section after the war, right here, the 14th Amendment gave former slaves, now known as freedmen, the same rights that other people had. So number 1, slaves were given rights like other people. So simply they were just given rights like other white people. Question number 2. It asks me, name 3 Mississippi leaders during Reconstruction. Alright, so we know back then at the time, and still now to this day, that a lot of our leaders are considered our government leaders. They lead us when it comes to our national laws and our state laws. And so if we go back to page 151, we see that they give us 3 names: James L. Alcorn, Hiram R. Revels, and John R. Lynch. So those would be 3 of some of the Mississippi leaders during this time, because we know James L. Alcorn was a governor in the new state government, and Hiram Revels and John R. Lynch served in the state legislature. So those would be an example of 3 leaders during Reconstruction. And I have my paper here so we don't get all confused. Okay, Hiram R. Revels and John R. Lynch. Okay, so those should be 3 names that you should have for question number 2. Alright, question number 3. How did Mississippi change after the Civil War? And we know by reading with our last lessons and then with Reconstruction, we know that Mississippi changed a whole lot during this time. So some ways that they changed were, first off, they made a new constitution. So that's pretty important, and so we need to list that. So I'm just going to do MS for Mississippi. So Mississippi made a new constitution. This is the time that we also saw slaves getting freed and getting certain rights. So slaves got certain freedoms and rights. And lastly, with our farmers, we saw that they had to start going to sharecropping, which we know that's when they had to rent out their land for other farmers to use so they could get money back as well. So we're just going to put sharecropping because we know that's when this started happening in Mississippi. So sharecropping. So these are some of the answers you should have for number 3. Okay, and then lastly, number 4, it says compare and contrast the lives of African Americans in Mississippi before and after the Civil War. So, might have to write a little small. So B is going to be before. So we know before they were slaves, and so they lived a really hard life and they weren't free. And that meant that they had to work and not get any money back. So, slaves lived hard lives and were not free. Okay, and then after, the A for after, and after we know the slaves were freed and they actually got to participate in sharecropping and they got to buy houses if they could afford them and they had the right to vote. So they did get a lot of certain rights and certain freedoms. So slaves, well, let's say African Americans. Okay. African Americans got freedoms, that fits, and the right to vote. But we also know during this time that the men were the only ones that got the right to vote, not the women. And that was the same way with the white people during that time too. Okay, so this is your think about it questions. You might have added some more or not put as much for number 4, and that's fine, just as long as you have some of the same answers that I have up here. Okay, so that's all of them, and I hope you did a really good job.